Okay, thank you for coming to License to Drill. Has North Sea Oil and Gas had its day? A Conservative Environment Network event kindly sponsored by Uplift. I'm Sam Payne, Climate Manager here at SEN. If you've not come across SEN before, we're the independent forum for Conservatives in the UK and around the world who support net zero, nature restoration and resource security. We've got a great lineup of speakers today who we'll hear from for about 3 minutes each before opening up to questions, so please do get thinking. The transition away from fossil fuels is in full swing, with massive investment switching from fossil fuels to renewables on a global scale. Meanwhile, the debate around new oil and gas licences rages on. This afternoon, we'll be discussing what comes next for the North Sea as the oil and gas basin enters its twilight years. Discussing this today, we have Charles Hendry, MP for Wealden from 2001 to 2015, and was also Minister of State at the Department for Energy and Climate Change from 2010 to 2012. We have Tessa, who is a founder and executive director of Uplift and international climate change lawyer and campaigner. And we have Simon Horner, who leads the Green Finance Institute strategy function and manages their government relationships and public affairs. We will also have Peter Aldous MP joining us, who's represented Waveney since 2010 and is a member of the SEN Parliamentary Caucus. You can tweet along with our events using hashtag SEN@CPC and hashtag CPC23. Our Twitter handle is SEN_HQ. So opening up, we'll go to Charles Hendry, and it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on how the political and economic narratives around oil and gas and the transition to renewables has changed since your time in the department. And also, how has the war in Ukraine impacted on the oil and gas transition?
Well, Sam, thank you, and thank you to SEN as well. I think this is the last of your formal events. You've got a quiz later, but you've done an unbelievably impressive range of events throughout conference, and congratulations to you and your colleagues for making that happen. So I left office 11 years ago. There have been 23 energy ministers. That may be a quiz question later. The 23 ministers since. I always thought the fundamental role of energy policy was to create a system that could withstand multiple unexpected external shocks. And you couldn't have imagined two greater shocks than a global pandemic followed by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And we've come through that remarkably well in the circumstances. You look at what Germany has done, has been utterly unbelievable, of getting its LNG facilities operating in the North German coast within 100 days of the invasion, and something which is quite extraordinary. And the ability to wean ourselves off Russian gas and to a lesser extent off Russian oil has been something which I don't think people would have thought was going to be possible. The North Sea has served us incredibly well for all of my lifetime and longer. It can play a very important part in the transition going forward. And I think one of the most exciting energy roles in the whole world is the work involved in taking one of the historic energy basins, oil and gas basins, and turning it into a net zero, low carbon hub. And the process of how we get there, though, is the one which is challenging and where a lot of detail still needs to be sorted out. There is inevitably a focus on new licenses and whether that is the right thing to do. I think we should look at that as saying, look, this is not so much about are we planning to have more gas in the mix than we had previously been doing, but saying we expect that to remain broadly the same, but we want, for security reasons, to have a higher proportion of that coming from our own domestic sources. Because domestic gas is inherently more secure than gas where you are dependent on others to provide it. It is lower in carbon than most imported gas, certainly than that which comes by shipment. It's not lower in carbon than Norwegian gas by pipeline, and it will be more expensive. But then the price is globalized, so you won't see that as an impact so much. Oil is more opaque in that regard because we don't refine UK diesel, we don't refine UK products so much in this market. So a lot of the oil produced here is exported and then re-imported as finished products. So the North Sea still has an important role to play, but I think we then need to look at how does that go through a transition? What's the change which is coming down the path here? And the future of the jobs which depend on it, the future of the UK as a successful energy nation, is going to be shown by how we manage that process. And a lot of it is good, but a lot of it isn't there yet. And that the UK at the moment, I'm afraid, is not a particularly attractive place to invest if you're in the oil and gas or the broader energy sector. The tax rate in the United Kingdom, the increased profits tax which has recently been put in place, means that we are a less stable tax environment than Venezuela. And companies around the world are saying, do we actually want to come and invest in the UK? We're seeing that not a single company was prepared to bid in the latest offshore wind auction round. And that really must send alarm bells for the department and saying, what have we got wrong? We need to listen much more to industry to understand where their costs are. And we need to then say, look, there is a fantastic prize here. In a course of 15 years, the offshore wind sector has moved from being a new industry to a mature industry. The UK is the undisputed global leader. And there are a number of areas where I think we can say we want to make that happen again. Carbon capture should be one of them. We can develop that technology here, we can lead the world, but we've got to move that process forward. The bidding rounds are too slow, the setting out of the Track 2 system has been too slow. We're going to lose those opportunities to the US and elsewhere in Europe and beyond if we don't make the most of it. I'm not sure we can be global leaders in hydrogen, but we can be very significant. But again, the UK is losing some of its attractiveness to the United States because of the Inflation Reduction Act and that the changes which the EU is making to attract investment there. We could be global leaders in tidal, more West Coast perhaps than on the East Coast of the UK. But we're not taking that forward. So if we want to be a global player, we've got to have more decisiveness. We've got the ambition. But what we've got to say is, look, if we're going to meet those targets, and I believe we can and we must, then we've got to have a much clearer plan for how it's going to happen, who needs to do what by when, and for the government to move this faster.
Thank you very much. A lot of big topics mentioned there that I'm sure will come up throughout the course of this discussion. Peter, it would be interesting to hear your views on the balance that the government should seek to achieve between promoting oil and gas and renewables. I'd really be interested to know, do you think the government is doing enough to support the renewable energy sector?
Right, I apologise for turning up late because I was coming from a similar briefing which put on by Bright Blue. I think an awful lot of what Charles has just said is, I would agree with that. I think that the approach or the strategy that we have in place in the UK for promoting the energy sector generally and promoting the transition is the right one. I think if we look at the offshore wind industry, the arrangements, the contracts for difference arrangements that I think Charles was instrumental in putting in place have worked. I think probably if we look at the CFD auction round, there was, I think the flashing lights were flashing at the beginning of the year. And at that time, probably in government, there was oh, don't worry, chaps, we are the global leaders. The rest are playing catch up. No problems here. And actually, by the time it clicked, there was a problem. In probably about June or July time, it was too late. And so we have got some retrieval to do there. The feedback that I get from industry is that this is not terminal. It can be retrieved. A lot of those businesses have put a lot of investment in, and they like the UK as a place to invest generally. But investors behind those companies are globally footloose, and ultimately, if we don't address these problems pretty quickly, then a lot of that investment will go elsewhere. And the Conservative model of acting as a catalyst and leveraging in what are enormous sums of money to get the transition through as quickly as possible is the right one. We haven't heard a great deal about the Labour approach. We probably won't hear a great deal about it. But it could be extremely expensive, and I'm not sure that that we can afford to do that. But if we go back to the Prime Minister's announcements a couple of weeks back, if you look at some of the items individually, you could go along with it. And if you look, when we've got in 2016, we introduced the net zero by 2050 target, enshrined it in law, and that is something to be, as Conservatives, to celebrate. We needed immediately to be backing that up with realistic, but stretched and ambitious targets. Certainly, if we look towards phasing out the sale of petrol and diesel cars. And we didn't do that. Now, I think we can say that in this what has been a pretty turbulent period from 2016 to 2023, with Brexit, with COVID, with the war in the Ukraine, the latter two all leading to the cost of living crisis and the conscious of the challenges that a lot of people out there are facing. You could perhaps could understand how those targets, how needed readjustment and had become unachievable. But I think we could have actually done more in actually putting those targets in place. Other things were happening in government in that period, and if the Prime Minister's announcement 2 weeks ago, if that's it, it's not enough. And I think we, over the next few weeks, probably leading up to the autumn statement, we need to be articulating a clear vision and putting firmly down that sensible, ambitious route map. There are some people who say that we don't want to be an outlier. Well, we're going quicker than everyone else. Well, if we're actually at the front of the pack, that actually then helps attract investment, helps attract jobs. And, we are, quite frankly, I don't want to be in the middle of the pack when it comes to the transition. It's for the benefit of the country as a whole, is if we cross that finishing line first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And Tessa, we'd really like to hear your thoughts on the government's progress on the energy transition, particularly in light of recent announcements regarding new oil and gas licences. And in particular, do you think the government's current oil and gas policy is compatible with reaching net zero?
Thanks so much, Sam, and many thanks to Sen for the collaboration on this panel. We're really grateful for that. I just want to start, first by saying that I really echo much of what Peter and Charles have already said, but I think, there is really no question that the UK has done an extraordinary job of the energy transition in recent years in terms of the pace and scale at which we've decarbonised the power sector, specifically gotten rid of coal in our electricity supply, and of course the growth of our offshore wind sector. And I think we're still in an incredibly enviable position in terms of our natural renewable resources, the investment base, the skills base that is here in the UK, that means that we've got the potential to really maintain and build on our status as being world leading in renewables development. I think the challenge, as has been identified, is that we've got to find a way of making sure that new oil and gas production in the North Sea is compatible with the development of that renewables industry, that it is also assisting us with our goals of energy security and energy affordability, and of course, to your point, Sam, that it's also reconcilable with the UK's climate targets, as well as the climate targets that the oil and gas sector has set for itself. So taking each of those in turn, and starting with the question of energy affordability and energy security, I think that's front of mind for millions of people going into this winter. Yes, the energy price cap has come down recently, but energy bills are still twice what they were for a typical household this year compared to 2020. And we've also started this year with about 5 million people already in debt to their energy suppliers as a result of the exceptionally high bills that they faced last winter. So we know that actually the UK had the highest household energy bills of any country in Western Europe, according to the International Monetary Fund. That's because of our exceptional dependency on gas to heat our homes, as well as a proportion of our electricity mix. And of course, gas prices were what spiked and have been particularly volatile in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think even in a situation where the North Sea can provide us with energy security, and I think that's worth interrogating a bit further, but that in itself doesn't translate to affordable energy, which I think is the real challenge that millions of households are facing this year and indeed for years to come as the forecasts for volatile oil and gas prices continue. But briefly, I think on the energy security question, I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that 70% of what's left in the North Sea is actually oil. And as we heard from Charles, we don't have the refinery capacity in the UK to process that oil, so it ends up being exported and sold back to us, which really doesn't give us any advantage over any other buyer on the international market. To the second point about how we reconcile the ongoing investment in new oil and gas production with the development of our renewable energy industry, there was recent research published by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis that basically concluded that there is effectively a trade-off, that the offshore wind industry shares critical supply chains with the offshore oil and gas sector. Both rely on a limited pool of available ports, vessels and personnel, and so stimulating both sectors at the same time effectively can spur competition over scarce resources, and we've seen some of that around supply chains already, given the pressure on supply chains. And basically that means that you are looking at a situation where you have a zero-sum game. And I think that's something worth bearing in mind when we're trying to reach that 50 gigawatt offshore wind target that the government set for itself. I think third, there are questions, as Sam's asked me to address, around whether or not new oil and gas production is compatible with the UK's climate targets. So just to start with the targets that the sector has set for itself through the North Sea Transition Deal, and which only apply to the emissions caused by extracting oil and gas in the North Sea, not from burning that oil and gas. So we know that according to emissions monitoring data from the North Sea Transition Authority itself, that the oil and gas sector isn't currently on track to meet its own upstream emissions reduction targets as enshrined in the North Sea Transition Deal, starting at 2030, its 2030 target, and going beyond that. And those targets within the North Sea Transition Deal have been criticised by the Climate Change Committee, the government's independent climate advisors, for not being sufficiently robust to align with what's actually needed for the UK's carbon budgets to meet a net zero target. So while I think, the UK's oil and gas sector prides itself on having cleaner extraction than some of its counterparts, and that is used, I think, as a rationale for continuing to invest in new oil and gas production here. The truth is that according to Rystad Energy, which is an independent energy analyst, we are basically in the bottom half of the global league table in terms of how clean our upstream emissions are. And we continue to rely on practices like venting and flaring of gas that have been outdated in countries like Norway for decades. Finally, it is also difficult to reconcile long-term new oil and gas projects with the trajectory for oil and gas production that's needed for a safe climate, and namely that 1.5 degree threshold and goal that the UK has signed up to and is ultimately working towards with its net zero target. So we heard from the premier expert energy agency, the International Energy Agency, just last week, that in a scenario where we get to net zero in 2050, there isn't room for new oil and gas projects. And what they confirmed in that report was also that we're seeing the speed of the energy transition happening faster than they've anticipated. So they've brought forward their date for peak fossil fuel demand. And I think that's also reflected, as we heard from Charles, in what we've seen across Europe in terms of how fast a number of other countries have gone. Germany obviously had massive imperatives to transition away from Russian gas as quickly as possible, but when it put its foot on the gas, so to speak, terrible pun, it managed to basically decrease fossil fuel demand by 25% in its domestic energy system within 6 months. So we are seeing demand declining faster than has been previously anticipated. And I think that, as we've all been saying, there's a real opportunity for the UK to lead in that transition, to maximise the opportunities and the payoffs associated with it, in the same way that we've led on the transition away from coal, and indeed the way that we've led on climate change more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa. And now, Simon, we'd really like to hear your thoughts on the energy transition from a finance and investment perspective. In particular, we'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the financial risks of continued investment in the North Sea and how businesses can avoid stranded assets. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for coming. So a couple of thoughts on the transition and what it means for the financial sector. So I think there is a lot of kind of rhetoric knocking about now about what it means to finance the transition, and also about a lot of oil and gas companies kind of self-identifying as being part of the transition. Now, that's true in some sense and less so in others. So oil and gas is part of the transition in one sense, in that we need to keep the lights on whilst we transition to renewable energy. And we sort out our base load probably via nuclear power. So it is part of the transition while we wait for that to happen. But the corollary of that is that for that to be true, we need to actually have a plan on renewables. Otherwise, oil and gas is not part of the transition. Oil and gas is just how we are powering our economy. So it's two sides of the same coin, which means unless we have a really strong roadmap to roll out of renewable energy, then oil and gas, ironically, can't be part of the transition. So it's actually contingent on what we're doing in renewable energy. So that's a really important point. And that's why we need to do everything we can to offer investors that sense of certainty on renewables, and where it's necessary, things like CFD, things like offtake agreements that offer businesses a route to market, a route to commercial scale, etc. And then from an investor perspective, I think what that means is a couple of things. One is if you're lending to oil and gas companies or investing in them, in the round you're not financing the transition unless you're ring-fencing that finance to something specific within the oil and gas supply chain or within an oil and gas company's decarbonisation plan. So CCUS or any form of carbon capture and storage or reduction. Advancing like vanilla finance to the oil and gas industry is not transition finance. As I say, it's part of the transition, but if and only if we're doing what we need to do on renewables. And then on stranded assets, I think the simple point is, again, it's related to everything that we're trying to do on renewables. So we're trying to offer investors as much certainty as possible, and as much sort of price support as possible. There's a sense in which ultimately oil and gas assets and oil and gas companies will and should become stranded assets for all of the reasons that we should be now familiar. It's not ultimately compatible with our net zero target to continue burning oil and gas well past 2050. Like, that's just economically correct. So it's actually, I think, for the finance sector, not necessarily in our interests to offer that sense of certainty of investing in the oil and gas industry. It should become more risky over time, and people are obviously free to invest in it as they see fit, and they can chase returns, as many people have done in the last couple of years and done very well out of it, and that's fine. We're not sort of saying that you can't do that. But what we're trying to do is offer investors as much certainty on the renewable side, not on the oil and gas side. So the case in point would be sustainable aviation fuel, which requires very specific manufacturing processes. There's a lot of uncertainty around the go-to-market route for companies involved in that. So ultimately, versions of a CFD will have to be offered in that space. Versions of offtake agreements will have to be offered in that space, so that investors know that there are customers waiting at the end if they invest in sustainable aviation fuel plants. But you wouldn't expect similar price support on oil and gas going forward. And the closer we get to 2050, I would expect it to become more and more risky to invest in that sector. That's just economic good sense. So I think it's important through all of this that we see this as two sides of the same coin. The only other thing I'd say is advancing finance to oil and gas within the CCUS space is fine, but we need to be very careful about what's viable. There is a lot of unproven technology and very unclear business models within the CCUS space. So again, it can't be a catch-all solution to say we're going to keep burning oil and gas, and at some point we're going to sort out the CCUS technology, and that's how it will all magically come together. It may do. And the UK, for reasons we've talked about, re the North Sea, could be very competitive from a storage perspective, but that is unproven. And if we put all our eggs in that one basket and it doesn't really come off, we'll be left in 2050 having missed all of our targets, frankly. So that's I think, the investor perspective. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you very much. So just before I open up to questions, I'm going to ask two very similar ones to Charles and then to Tessa. So firstly, Charles, what impact do you think the recent CFD auction round have on the UK's perceived position as a global leader on net zero?
It's a temporary blip, I think, as Peter was saying, that it is not a knockout blow, it's something which we can come back from. But it does show that the government needs to listen more carefully to industry. And when industry was saying we will not bid at these prices, and then government still went ahead and said these are the prices, they should not have been surprised that that was the response which they got. So the lesson for government here is you have to engage with industry, you have to listen to them, and you have to believe them when they say that we cannot work at these prices. That we had a fantastic outcome. So when I was minister, offshore wind was £170 a megawatt hour. And I set industry the challenge to bring that down to £100 per megawatt hour for projects being given final investment decision in 2020. Now, as we all know, the price came down to £40-ish per megawatt hour. And the industry played an absolute blinder in totally reinventing the offshore wind turbine, in changing the way in which they did business, bringing in different construction models, working with the oil and gas sector. And that's what made it happen. But we had to recognise this wasn't like solar and you could just keep on getting the prices edging down further. There came a point when you couldn't go lower. The auction process meant that you could only meet those prices by importing most of the parts and giving the jobs, for the industrial jobs, to countries overseas. And that was, I think, a failure to join up energy policy and industry policy. And then ultimately with inflation where it is as well and changing interest rates, it was inevitable that prices would be going up. If you looked at the Irish round a few months ago, it was very clear where the price range on this was going to be. And so this was, I'm afraid it was an own goal, but it's by no means a defeat. It's something from which we need to learn. We need to say, okay, we will have a better, more constructive engagement, and we remain committed to delivering it. One thing which has not received so much publicity from the PM statement 2 weeks ago is his commitment to taking forward faster the grid reinforcements that are going to be necessary. Because one of the biggest hold-ups for our renewable programme at the moment is the failure to be able to deliver the grid investment that is going to be necessary. Now, if he can really get a grip of that, and Claire Coutinho can, then that will be a transformative moment, and it will mean that we can really see those ambitions realised.
Thank you very much. And so Tessa, similar but slightly different, what impact do you think the granting of new licences have on the UK's perceived position as a global leader in net zero?
Well, I think it's, if you look at the reception during Climate Week in New York, the UN General Assembly convening a couple of weeks ago, and the reception that I think the UK government got there, it suggests that it has tarnished the reputation of the UK, which, I really can't overstate just how powerful I think the UK's brand was internationally, not just because of all of its domestic achievements, but also because of the leadership role it's played multilaterally and globally in co-founding the Powering Past Coal Alliance, as the host of COP26, also as a co-convener of a new initiative, the Glasgow Group, to end international public finance for fossil fuels. It was really at the forefront, I think, of driving international leadership. And I think as the focus has increasingly shifted to the role of fossil fuels in our energy system, partly spurred on by Russia's war on Ukraine and all of the vulnerabilities that's exposed, but also an understanding that, there is no getting to net zero without transitioning pretty rapidly away from oil and gas. I think it's considered pretty difficult to reconcile that decision by the UK government at this time.
Thank you very much. So we'll now open up to questions. We'll have a roving mic. So we've got, go for the 3 hands up, Jordan.
Hiya, I'm Helena Horse and I work for The Guardian. So the rhetoric at this conference, though the policy on net zero hasn't changed a huge amount, some of the rhetoric might lead some voters to believe that this government does not take net zero or climate that seriously. For example, Suella Braverman just referred to net zero as a luxury belief. And Claire Coutinho yesterday referred to people who are campaigning for it as zealots. Do you find it difficult listening to that, and do you think it's damaging to the Conservative brand?
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Adrian Morgan, I'm from Weaver Vale. My question is that we are surrounded as an island nation, and I hear nothing about tidal. That's got to be part of our energy mix going forward. When you think of it, solar doesn't work in winter, turbines can't work in severe weather. Why aren't we looking more strategically at tidal power?
Thank you. And then I think there was a final one just at the back.
Hi, my name is Lillian, and I have a question to Simon. When you talk about energy transition, which could be renewable and basically oil and gas, would you consider whether there is another way of transition, which is called eco-franking, which technically just to make the oil and gas industry to have more purified kind of solution to have this environmental with technology solution to have because of, in my personal view, it is nearly impossible to believe in defense department or in aviation department or in crisis management when it comes to for critical disaster management, will be able to manage without fossil fuel or oil and gas. In other words, when you talk about, say, we're going to envisage in the future, you're going to only have renewable energy, I think that's, in my personal view, that's mission impossible. And I very much would like to believe there is another way, we call it transition, not necessarily means a transition from all oil and gas to renewable. There is another way which is called more purified oil and gas. So would you consider CEN, Conservative Environment Network? I have great passion towards the environment, so I do support environment, don't make me wrong. So I just say, would you consider there is another commercial leverage which CEN could work with someone like British Petroleum to see whether there is a way called eco-franking, which has high-tech way of doing oil and gas, and to make it it's more purified. Then that will help the long-haul aviation situation, will help disaster management.
Thank you very much. I think we've got the drift of the question. Thank you. So firstly, Peter, I'll turn to you regarding the government. Is it taking net zero seriously?
I think just addressing that question specifically, I represent a constituency in the east of England, coastal community, right at the forefront of climate change, and also actually see net zero as in a positive light as an opportunity to bring jobs to the area and to have sustainable economic development. People I liaise with an awful great deal, and Charles would know them, the East of England Energy Group, which is made up of you name it, all the technologies and they are 100% committed to net zero. It's what our focus on the region is. None of those people I would describe as zealots or believing in luxury goods. This is an absolute, vital sort of mission that we're on, and it's challenging with the whole cost of living crisis. It's put a whole new dimension on that. Just on I'll take the third point if I can very, very quickly. This is called net zero. There are different challenges around the world, and we've got different opportunities areas. The UK, I think, has enormous assets, and we can lead the way. And yes, I am a supporter of the North Sea oil and gas industry. It's brought jobs and prosperity to the east of England, to Aberdeen and other areas over the years. But we are, if you like, moving towards, shall we say, the evening in the life of extraction and oil and gas from the on the UK continental shelf, and we need to do that responsibly and sustainably over the next 30 odd years. With regard to tidal, I think Charles will be able to speak with enormous great authority on that. I believe that with this challenge that we have, we need to use all the tools in the box, and tidal has a role. If we come back to the tidal lagoon at Swansea, and as I said, Charles has views on that and he'll set those forward, but I know it was a decision not to go ahead of it that actually did cause Greg Clark an awful lot of thought and pain and angst before he came down on that decision.
Thank you very much, Peter. And with that, we'll now turn to Charles on your thoughts on tidal power.
So I read a review on Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon for the government. I said it was a no-brainer. The government should go ahead with it. It made a great economic sense. It was a sector where the UK could be a leader. Not to the extent of offshore wind, but that it was an area where we ought to be pioneering and take that forward. We have the second highest tidal ranges in the world. We should be harnessing it. And if we don't do it now, the Chinese will do it, and we'll end up importing the technology and the know-how from them. Had the government given the go-ahead to Swansea Bay and my report, it would be built by now, and it would be cheaper than gas. So even though that was going to be quite an expensive model, you got the real benefits when you would then do it at scale at Cardiff or North Wales and areas like that. So I remain deeply disappointed that the government decided not to do it, and I hope that they will review that in due course. If I may also come on the net zero question. I think the Prime Minister's speech a couple of weeks ago was knocked off course by the leak. And I think he probably wanted to be much more proactive and making it very clear that he remained extremely committed to net zero, and there were ways in which we could actually deliver that in a way that would carry people with us more. And so we should see his speech as being a restatement of commitment to net zero, even if some of the target dates were changing. I think we should learn from Australia that any government, any party here which goes into an election on an anti-climate package will lose, and lose badly. And therefore that we've got to make the case ever more strongly that this is a direction of travel which our country should be adopting and following. So you can, I think, move the date on EVs by 5 years without any significant difference. I think the mistake probably was bringing it forward for 5 years without having a plan on how to deliver it. And therefore now realigning it with France and Germany makes sense. But I don't hear anything from him suggesting that he is pulling back from the net zero commitment. But I think we also do recognise that there are some people who will glue themselves to pavements or paint windows and things, and who are showing a zealotry which does drive away people from the centre ground, and they don't help the debate. And that it would be much better if some of those people, and you have Insulation Rebellion, who are very skilled people often, and they would be much more useful going into an old people's home and improving the insulation than blocking motorways. And I think those are the people who are seen as being zealots, and it's not the people who care about climate change.
Thank you very much. And Simon, I'm now going to turn to you regarding the tidal question. And I think it opens a bit of a wider debate around new and emerging technologies. Obviously, we've heard how the price of offshore wind has fallen. What could the government be doing to help these emerging industries, such as tidal and other emerging renewable sources?
Yeah, it's the right question. I totally agree with Charles on what he said about that decision-making process. I mean, ultimately, it's about offering investors certainty that there will be a buyer for some of these sources of energy. So on tidal, it's the same. You can, and I think I totally agree on the CFD point. Like, it's a setback, but it's not kind of the end of days. It was still a pioneering UK model, and that's the sort of thing we need to roll out for tidal and other technologies, including sustainable aviation fuel. It's pretty simple. If you guarantee someone that you're going to buy their product once you've made it, that's a pretty good incentive to invest in a plant, and you can raise bank finance and whatever else accordingly. On the question on the sort of making oil and gas cleaner, and it always being part of the mix, I think I'd say a better bet for our baseload is nuclear. Nuclear is in the taxonomy, and we should have done more to invest in nuclear, and you can see the problems that are currently ongoing in Germany and Japan, for either rolling back or, in the case of Germany, just ending their involvement in nuclear. We do owe it to ourselves, as long as we are burning oil and gas, to make it as clean as possible, of course, and I think investing in those technologies is important. But I would say on the net zero, the chances are we will still be emitting in 2050. I think the answer to that is as much about what's called greenhouse gas removal technology as it is about CCUS. So yes, burning oil and gas and capturing the carbon is important, but actually more profoundly interesting and impactful is when you can take carbon out of the atmosphere. And I hope that will ultimately be what we mean when we say net zero.
Thank you very much. It's very sort of two issues there that I'd really like some thoughts on from Tessa. Firstly, can we reduce the production of emissions from oil and gas by, for example, banning flaring and venting sooner? And then secondly, regarding CCS, is it a technology that will be utilised in the energy transition, and how important will it be? Or is it just a sort of false hope? Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, clearly, as I said, the UK currently ranks relatively poorly compared to other major oil and gas producers in terms of how clean our upstream emissions are. So there is obviously potential for there to be greater effort made to reduce those emissions, and bringing forward the ban on venting and flaring, which would actually align with the UK's methane pledge, which is to significantly reduce methane emissions by 2030, is one way of doing that. And at the moment, there is basically enough gas flared annually from North Sea oil and gas projects to power about 700,000 homes. So it's a hugely wasteful practice, and it's also environmentally incredibly damaging, given methane is effectively a super pollutant in terms of its power as a greenhouse gas. So I think that's certainly true, and that's fairly low-hanging fruit in terms of cleaning up the act of the oil and gas industry. I think it's still important to bear in mind that the vast majority of emissions from oil and gas do come from burning that oil and gas, more than 80%. So cleaning up the upstream production only gets you so far in terms of reducing emissions. As to your second point, which I've briefly forgotten.
It was just regarding CCS.
Yes, yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, basically CCS is a technology that currently globally is capturing fewer than 10 million tonnes of carbon and is largely being used by the oil and gas industry as a way of extracting more oil and gas. I mean, it's really not working as promised as a technology to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's no question that on the current trajectories, and if you look at the pathways and models used by different agencies, including the Climate Change Committee, carbon capture plays a role in some of those models, but really exclusively for very difficult to decarbonise sectors. It's certainly not a licence to continue increasing oil and gas production. And I think, it's important to be conscious of the moral hazard around relying on not just CCS, but also, I think, carbon dioxide removal and other technologies, which may indeed be necessary. And there is investment in those technologies, but we're simply not seeing them scale and operational, beyond sort of pretty small pilot projects at a scale that means that they're commercially meaningful. I mean, they're still very, very expensive, and also simply aren't that efficient in terms of emissions reductions. So relying on those as a premise for increasing our emissions is, I think, very dangerous and isn't something that we should be relying on at all.
Thank you very much. I see we've got another couple of questions. Jordan. So we'll go to Joe first, and then gentleman in the front, and then we've got one just in the aisle further back.
Thank you. Councillor Joe Porter from Staffordshire Moorlands District Council, and also I sit on the Sen Advisory Council. Regarding the new oil site decision that was made recently, I mean, like Peter, I support North Sea oil, the fact that obviously it's provided a lot of jobs and economic growth over the years, but obviously that transition is really important. And the thing that I'm conscious of is when it comes to what the Prime Minister said in the announcement, he's right that we've got to take people with us, but I think some of the language around culture wars and trying to bring net zero into the culture wars, I think that's a mistake. I think what we should be doing is doing what Theresa May said last night in her speech, talking about the fact that we have a huge economic opportunity with the transition to net zero. She mentioned the £1 trillion value of the transition to the green industrial revolution. I think that's what the Prime Minister needs to focus on, rather than it being a wedge or a culture war issue. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on the language that we use around this debate. Thank you.
I just want to make a link to what I'm going to say and just say the word coastal erosion. But I wanted to come back to Simon. You can hear my accent is German. And Germans are rightly blamed for not tackling coal and the problem with the gas. But I don't think that means that morally and ethically we are wrong on nuclear energy. Angela Merkel has rightly said that she didn't want to take the risk after Fukushima to be responsible for something like that. And you are all discussing here projects like HS2, which are very expensive, and similar costs can be attributed to the nuclear sector. And you haven't found yet investors into Sizewell C. The costs of Hinkley went up. So my question to you is, where do you see nuclear in that? And is it really, really the ethical, clean, environmentally friendly solution that it is being portrayed as?
Thank Chris Hewitt from Solar Energy UK. My question is around the level play, or the what the energy sector needs is a level playing field for investment. And I just want to give you one example of how the government's current approach is now tilting that playing field towards investment in oil and gas. So after the price of energy went up, and the price of gas went up, pushed the price of electricity up, there was a windfall tax placed on electricity. It affected the renewable sector, the gas generators were exempted, the oil and gas sector also had its own windfall tax. They were allowed to offset that with the investment in future extraction. The renewable sector was not offered that exemption for future investment. So in what possible universe can that make sense in terms of our net zero targets, and just providing a level playing field? We're now supporting investment in fossil fuels over investment in renewables.
Thank you very much. So Tess, I'll turn to you first regarding the economic opportunity of net zero and the importance of the language that's being used.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously think that, net zero is the economic opportunity of the century, and that's something that we are seeing in the moves being made by the US in terms of, investing more than £300 billion via the Inflation Reduction Act in economic opportunities associated with the energy transition. The EU's considering or in the middle of developing a similar response. So, I mean, I think that also, given the natural gifts that this country's been given, its endowments in terms of renewable energy, as I said, the skills base that it has, it's an obvious entry point for the UK's long-term prosperity. And I imagine it will be inevitably the backbone of so many jobs and communities to come. So I think that it's really misleading to suggest that it's something that the UK can't afford when it's such a massive opportunity. Obviously, there are costs associated with some parts of the energy transition, you know, especially in relation to household infrastructure, and we've got to make sure that the most vulnerable aren't made liable for supporting those costs. But on the whole, they are the ones who, in so many ways, have the most to gain if we look at our housing stock. I mean, again, just referring to the millions of people who couldn't afford to pay their energy bills, partly that's also a function of how poorly insulated our homes are, and that would be a way of both, you know, creating a long-term industry around energy efficiency, reducing people's energy bills, and also ensuring that we have a whole range of great social and health outcomes that come with warmer homes as well. So I think that that's very clear.
Thank you. So we've got just over 5 minutes left. So I know Peter's quite keen to come in on this question, and then we'll cover the last two. So Peter,
I'll just quickly try and cover all three very, very quickly. First of all, I do agree it is a great economic opportunity. If I look at the area that I come from, the east of England, from East Anglia, all of a sudden, as a result of the transition, a great deal of the UK's power by 2050 could come through East Anglia. And for some of my colleagues and some people, that is a challenge with regard to pylons and transmission. For constituencies like the one I represent, which is a Lowestoft coastal community, it's a tremendous opportunity, and we can't squander that. So you're spot on, and language is very, very important. A previous Prime Minister, I forget how many ago now, if you remember, did come out. I think he was misquoted, and I think he said something he shouldn't have done when he said green crap, but it did knock confidence, and we have to watch our language very, very carefully. On Chris Hewitt and the level playing field, that particular issue I agree with wholeheartedly, and we need to get rid of that as quickly as possible. That is probably one for the. I'm sitting here now as I am, where my focus is on that autumn statement, which is going to take place sometime in November. That's what we should be aiming to get the Chancellor to announce then. The gentleman here on nuclear, I am supportive of nuclear, and just final comment. With all energy technologies have passionate advocates for and against them. And what you can find is that technology moves forward, everyone's very excited about it, and then and you're seeing this with hydrogen, and suddenly you say, oh, hang on, that's not quite what I want. And you then skip to the next technology. And the result is you do nothing. And my view is that nuclear, with that base load suiting the UK, for the UK, is the best solution.
Thank you very much. Just continuing with the theme of nuclear, I'd now like to turn to Charles.
So I was the minister when Germany decided to bring forward the closure of its plants. And I said to my German counterpart, I said, does this mean that you don't want us to build new nuclear in the UK? And he looked horrified and said, no, you must, because we will need to import the energy. So that there was a slightly mixed perspective on that. I understand why Germany did it. There was always nervousness. The CDU had just lost Baden-Württemberg to the Greens on the nuclear issue, and they couldn't have taken a different approach. And whilst it doesn't, I think, work as a technology perhaps for Germany, it does for the UK. But I think that we're seeing the last now of the large-scale nuclear plants for the UK, assuming that Sizewell does ever get built. Assuming they ever actually finish Hinkley Point as well. But I think the future for us is going to be small modular reactors. I think that offers a much better way forward, because the large ones, the UK model of trying to get the private sector to build them, these are simply just too big and too expensive. Most companies cannot take 30 billion of debt on their balance sheets and then not get paid for 20 years. And so that if you want large-scale nuclear, I think government has to build it on its balance sheet, and then it can privatise it if it wants to. And so we have to look at the way other countries have done that, but SMR offers a more flexible approach. I would just also say I completely agree with Peter on language. I spent the whole of my time in the energy sector trying to take energy out of politics, because people, they're desperate to see progress on climate change. They're frightened about the bills. They're nervous about energy security. They want to see multi-year, multi-parliament approaches being taken to these issues, which gives them confidence that we can address it. And we do live in a scary time, but also an incredibly exciting time. This is an unparalleled era of innovation and invention. And the UK is doing some absolutely phenomenal work in that area. And I would love to see much more joined up thinking between the parties, much more cooperation about how we deliver this and how we reassure people about the sense of travel, because this is the mission of our lives. This is going to be one of the defining things which changes this country for the better, and where we leave a much better world for our children. So let's take it out of politics. Let's be very careful about the language, and let's deliver the best outcome we can.
Thank you. And so just before we turn to closing remarks, Simon, regarding a level playing field for investment.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Chris said. I think we have to put that right. As I said, on the transition, like oil and gas can only be seen to be part of it if we're doing everything we can to build up renewables. Otherwise, you're just burning oil and gas. So if we don't have at least a level playing field, in fact, we should be doing far more to offer investors certainty investing in renewables than in oil and gas. If we're not doing that, then the notion of transition is illusory, basically. And just on nuclear, if I may, I think I don't know if it's unethical. Nuclear. I do know that it's low carbon, and it's a lot lower carbon than the 3 lignite coal-fired power stations that Germany fired up in the midst of the gas crisis. That's all I would say. And I think France and the UK at least have a reasonably strong safety record, and certainly nothing to compare to Fukushima.
Thank you. And very conscious of time, we've got less than a minute left. So if we can try to keep it to no more than a sentence each. Is the government doing enough, and what more can be done to help reach net zero? We'll move down the table, starting from Peter.
I think, Sam, I can be very, very short. We need a route map as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And Tessa?
I would actually point people to research that was recently published by UCL, which basically shows that if the government was really ambitious on the demand side in terms of actually just matching what some of our neighbours are doing in relation to EVs, in relation to heat pump installations, we could basically be completely free of fossil fuels by 2045, and we could certainly eliminate dependency on imports of oil and gas much earlier than that. So, I think there is a huge opportunity there, and it's really up to the government to grasp it.
Thank you. Charles?
So we've got a phenomenal track record. So 13 years ago, 5% of our electricity came from renewables, is now well over 40%, we're often well over 50%. But we've now got to really build on that. We know what the challenges are, we know what the timescales are, we've got to work to. And that's going to need new policy drivers as well. We've got to do more about energy efficiency. I cannot understand why we don't have a more joined up thought on that process. We've got to have greater clarity about the investment environments for the large scale renewable sectors. We've got to do much more about consenting so we can get the grid infrastructure in place. There's a lot which needs to change, but let's not lose sight of how much has been achieved.
Thank you. And Simon?
Thanks. So I think the Prime Minister was right that you can't ask people who can't afford it to bear the cost of net zero. That's just factually true, and you won't bring people with you if you ask them to do that. So what is true is that the vast majority of the capital needs to come from the private sector, so the government needs to do absolutely everything it can to provide stability and certainty to crowd that investment in, because that's the only alternative.
Thank you very much, and let's give it up for Peter, Charles, Tessa and Simon for their fascinating panel. Once again, thank you very much to Uplift for sponsoring this panel. The next event in here will be in half an hour. Do votes grow on trees? In the meantime, do head over to the stand if you'd like to learn more about energy efficiency. Thank you.